When you hear the word Viking, what comes to mind? Maybe you picture fierce warriors, horned helmets, and fiery raids across Europe. But the truth is far richer and far more fascinating. Behind the legends of blood and steel was a society full of farmers, craftsmen, traders, and families. A people who built a world as complex as it was brutal. Today, let's step into that world, the daily life of the Vikings. Farming in the frozen north, the Vikings lived in a land of extremes: long winters, short summers, rocky soil, and icy seas. Yet, they survived. Not only survived, they thrived. At the heart of Viking life was agriculture. They grew grains like barley, rye, and oats, staples that became bread, porridge, and ale. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was safer than water and consumed daily. In the valleys and on the coastal plains, families tended small farms. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Meat and dairy were vital, but so were wool and hides for clothing. This may surprise you. Many Vikings spent more time behind a plow than behind a sword. Raiding was seasonal, but farming was year-round. Even the fiercest warrior returned home to till the soil once the longship was pulled ashore. Masters of craft and trade, but the Vikings weren't just farmers. They were extraordinary craftsmen. Their blacksmiths forged iron into swords, spears, and axes, but also into plowshares, nails, and cooking tools. Jewelry of silver and bronze was intricately designed, not only for beauty, but also as a way to carry wealth. And then there were the ships. The Viking longship was a marvel of engineering, light and fast, able to sail the open seas yet shallow enough to slip into rivers. These ships weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of power, prestige, and freedom. Without them, there would be no Viking age. Their skills carried them beyond Scandinavia. Viking merchants traded furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves for silk from Byzantium, spices from the Middle East, and silver coins from the Islamic Caliphate. Through trade, they connected worlds thousands of miles apart. The social order of the North Viking society wasn't chaotic, as some imagine. It was structured, layered, and bound by law and tradition. At the top stood the Jarls, the nobles, wealthy landowners, and war leaders. Below them were the carls, the free farmers, craftsmen, and traders who formed the backbone of society. And at the bottom, the thrall slaves taken in raids or born into servitude. Thralls worked the hardest labor, but could sometimes earn freedom. Yet, despite this hierarchy, Viking society had something unusual for its time: a strong sense of community law. Disputes were settled in public assemblies called the Thing. Here, free men and in some cases free women could voice their concerns, witness trials, and agree on laws. It was rough justice, but it kept order in a world that might otherwise have descended into endless feuds. The power of Viking women. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Viking women enjoyed freedoms that shocked much of medieval Europe. A Viking woman could own land, manage farms, inherit property, and even divorce her husband. If her husband sailed off to raid or trade, she ran the household and the fields. In a society constantly on the move, women were the anchors that kept families alive. Archaeologists have uncovered graves filled with weapons buried alongside women, suggesting that some may have even fought. While it remains debated whether shield maidens truly existed as full warriors, what is certain is that women held power, influence, and respect uncommon for the time. Belief in the gods and the afterlife, but no exploration of Viking life would be complete without their religion. 2. The Vikings. The world was alive with gods, giants, and spirits. The chief deity was Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom, war, and poetry. Then there was Thor, the thunder god with his mighty hammer, protector of mankind. Freya, goddess of love and fertility. And Loki, the trickster, both friend and foe of the gods. Life was harsh, uncertain, and short, so their beliefs reflected that. The bravest warriors who died in battle were said to be carried to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. Others might go to Fokvanger, the field of the goddess Freya. Death was not the end, but the beginning of an eternal struggle. This worldview made the Vikings fearless. The fall in combat was not a tragedy, but an honor. Perhaps that is why they fought with such terrifying ferocity. But the gods of the north would not rule forever. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson brought the cross to the north, sometimes by persuasion, often by force. Slowly, Odin and Thor gave way to Christ and the church. A world of contradictions. So who were the Vikings? Really? Ruthless raiders? Yes, but also farmers, builders, lawmakers, and explorers. Their society was violent, yet surprisingly progressive. It enslaved thousands, yet gave women freedoms denied elsewhere. It worshipped gods of war, yet built thriving trade routes stretching from Baghdad to Newfoundland. The image of a Viking is not just the axe-wielding warrior, but the farmer plowing fields in the shadow of fjords, the craftsman forging iron in the glow of a fire, the woman managing a homestead, keeping a family alive, the skald, the poet singing of heroes by a flickering hearth. And this is what makes the Vikings so fascinating. They were not just destroyers of worlds, but creators of one. A people who could burn a monastery to the ground one day and build a thriving city the next. Their lives were filled with contradictions, and it's in those contradictions that their true story comes alive. So the next time you think of Vikings, don't just picture the raid, picture the farm, the forge, the family, and the faith. Because the story of the Vikings is not just about how they fought, but how they lived. The dawn of the Viking Age. From Lindisfarne to Ireland, the year was 793 AD. The wind carried the sharp scent of salt across the North Sea, and the waves echoed with the creak of wooden hulls and the rhythmic splash of oars. Out of the mist, sleek longships appeared low in the water, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the waves. They carried men unlike any the peaceful monks of England had ever seen. Tall, broad-shouldered warriors with axes glinting in the pale northern sun. That morning, the small monastery of Lindisfarne, a place of prayer, quiet devotion, and learning, was transformed into a scene of terror and bloodshed. The monks had no walls to protect them, no soldiers to defend them. For centuries, they had lived in peace, copying sacred texts, tending their flocks, and singing hymns. But when the Norsemen leapt ashore, they brought with them a storm of steel and fire. Ancient records speak of slaughtered priests, of treasures ripped from the altar, of holy relics shattered and cast aside. The Chronicles, written by horrified witnesses, described it as a divine punishment, an unholy invasion by heathen men. Historians today see this raid not as an isolated act of violence, but as the opening strike of a new era, the Viking Age. Why Lindisfarne? To understand why the Vikings chose Lindisfarne as one of their first major targets, we must look at both geography and opportunity. Lindisfarne, located off the coast of Northumbria in northern England, was a wealthy Christian monastery isolated on a tile island. It housed precious manuscripts, gold chalices, and relic symbols of the church's prosperity. To the Vikings, who valued wealth not only for survival, but also for status and power back home, monasteries represented easy plunder. But the choice was not purely economic. For the Vikings, monasteries were undefended, rich, and vulnerable. The warriors came from a land where kings and jarls measured their strength by the wealth and prestige they could gather. A successful raid on a foreign land elevated a leader as standing and ensured loyalty among his men. Lindisfarne was the perfect stage. The shock of the first raid, the brutality of the raid sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The Christian world, which saw monasteries as sacred spaces, could not imagine such desecration. To the Anglo-Saxons, it was unthinkable that God's house could fall so easily, yet to the Vikings, bound by different gods and a warrior ethos, monasteries were simply treasure vaults guarded by unarmed men. The Chronicles of Alkin, a Northumbrian scholar, described the event with horror, writing, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain, as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens desecrated God's sanctuaries, shed the blood of saints around the altar, trampled on the bodies of the saints in the temple of God." To Europe, this was a nightmare. To the Vikings, it was only the beginning. 795, the Vikings in Ireland. 2 years after Lindisfarne, The longships returned this time heading west across the Irish Sea. In 795, Viking sails appeared off the rugged coast of Ireland. They struck monasteries and settlements with the same ferocity that had stunned England. There, raids burned through the countryside, leaving smoke rising against the green hills. But here, the Vikings saw more than just wealth to be stolen. Ireland's rivers and natural harbors offered perfect opportunities for something greater. Bases of power, unlike the quick strike at Lindisfarne, the Irish coastline allowed the Vikings to establish footholds. They built fortified camps called long forts, often at river mouths or sheltered bays. From these bases, they could raid deeper inland and secure trade routes. Over time, these settlements grew into permanent towns. What began as raiding camps eventually became some of Ireland's most important cities: Dublin, Cork, and Limerick. These towns became hubs of trade where silver, slaves, furs, and exotic goods flowed in and out. For the Vikings, Ireland was not just a target of plunder, it became a land of opportunity, conquest, and settlement. Life behind the raids. To fully grasp why these raids were so significant, we must imagine the world of the Viking warriors. In Scandinavia, farmland was limited and harsh winters made survival a challenge. Families lived in longhouses, clustered in small communities, bound together by kinship and loyalty to their jarl or chieftain. Honor and reputation were the lifeblood of a Viking. Raiding was not only about survival, but also about prestige. A young man earned his place in society through bravery in battle and success abroad. Gold-armed rings, weapons, and stories of adventure all elevated a warrior's status. Wealth brought power, and power brought loyalty. The longship itself was a symbol of this culture. Long, narrow, and light, it could skim across open seas or shallow rivers alike. Its design allowed surprise attacks and rapid retreats. Without the longship, the Viking Age would not have been possible. The legacy of Lindisfarne and Ireland, the raids of 793 and 795 mark more than just violent attacks. They represent a turning point in European history. For centuries, the Norsemen had lived on the fringes of Europe, known only as traders and seafarers. But with Lindisfarne and Ireland, they announced themselves as a force that would shape the continent. The monasteries of England, the coasts of Ireland, and eventually the rivers of France and Spain all would feel the reach of the dragon-proud ships. What began as small bands of raiders would grow into great armies and settlers who left permanent marks on the lands they touched. From these early strikes, the Viking Age was born, an age of terror for some, an age of adventure and expansion for others. The echoes of that age still resound today in the ruins of monasteries, in the names of cities the Vikings founded, and in the stories of courage and survival passed down through history. The raids at Lindisfarne in 793 and Ireland in 795 were not isolated moments of violence. They were the sparks that ignited 2.5 centuries of Viking dominance. These events reshaped Europe's political and cultural landscape, from the quiet chants of monks broken by axe blows to the smoke rising over Irish harbors. The Vikings carved their presence into history with fire and iron. The image of longships appearing out of the morning mist became a symbol of fear and respect across Christendom. In the early 9th century, the monasteries of the British Isles lay silent and devoted to prayer. Yet their peace was shattered when the shadow of the north fell across the sea, the island of Iona. Once a beacon of Christian scholarship faced its first Viking storm in the year 800. The dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon. Raiders leapt ashore, and the monks, who had spent their lives copying sacred texts and tending to their faith, were slaughtered, their buildings burned, and their treasures taken. It was a wound of Christendom, yet the survivors tried to rebuild only for years later. In 806, the Vikings returned with greater force. This time, they left no mercy. 68 monks fell in a single day, their blood soaking into the sands. The monastery never recovered from such horror, and the name of Iona became a symbol of the Northern Terror. Spreading across Europe, the pattern of raids evolved quickly. The Vikings were no longer content with swift strikes. They sought bases from which to expand their reach. In 841, they found the perfect location on the eastern coast of Ireland, Dublin. Here, they established a longed for a fortified encampment for ships, stores, and warriors. At first, it was a seasonal camp, a place to winter and regroup, but it grew rapidly into a permanent settlement, a hub of trade and power. Dublin became the beating heart of Viking Ireland, from where silver flowed in, and slaves were carried out. Raids could be launched inland, while commerce connected Scandinavia to the wider world. By the middle of the 9th century, the Frankish kingdom was already familiar with the Viking scourge, but in 845 the scale changed forever, with Ragnar Lodbrok, the most legendary of all Viking figures, led a fleet of 120 ships up the river Seine toward the greatest prize of all, Paris. Imagine the city walls trembling as the sails filled the horizon. Ragnar and his men poured into the city. The King Charles the Bald was powerless to resist. He paid a vast ransom of 7,000 lives of silver to save his people, a fortune that made the Northmen rich beyond imagining, and taught Europe a better lesson. Cities once thought secure were vulnerable, and the Vikings would strike again and again. Meanwhile, across the sea, England was about to face its darkest hour. In 865, a force descended that was unlike any raid. Before Chronicles called it the Great Heathen Army, it was a coalition of warriors from every corner of Scandinavia, led by Ivar the Boneless and his brother Halfdan. These were not raiders seeking plunder alone, they were conquerors. Their goal was nothing less than the subjugation of kingdoms. They swept across England, mercilessly burning towns, toppling kings, demanding tribute. In 866, they captured the ancient city of York, the jewel of Northumbria, and transformed it into their capital. From York, they extended their grip across the land, reshaping the balance of power. Yet England was not destined to fall completely. In 878, the decisive moment came at the Battle of Edington. Alfred, King of Wessex, rallied his forces against the invaders. Though outnumbered and pressed to the brink, Alfred used cunning tactics and unyielding spirit to defeat the Vikings. The result was the Treaty of Wedmore, which created a fragile peace. It divided England into two realms, the Anglo-Saxon south and west, and the Viking-dominated Danelaw in the north and east. Though not a final victory for either side, it marked the survival of Anglo-Saxon England and the establishment of Viking rule within it. While England wrestled with its fate, France also saw peace. In 911, Rollo, a powerful Viking leader, struck a deal with King Charles the Simple at St. Clair. Sir Ep Rollo and his men were granted lands along the Seine estuary in exchange for defending the realm against further raids. This land became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Here, the Vikings settled, became lords, intermarried with the local population, and within generations forged a new identity. No longer raiders, but dukes who would one day play a decisive role in European history. The Eastern Vikings, known as Varangians, pushed down the great rivers of Russia, building trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea and the riches of Byzantium. In 941, they made a daring strike at Constantinople itself, the queen of cities. Their longships filled the Bosporus, and their warriors threatened the greatest empire of the age. Yet the walls of Constantinople were unbreakable. Greek fire, a terrible weapon, spewed flames across the waters, consuming ships and men alike. The Vikings were forced to retreat, but their presence could not be ignored. Before long, Byzantine emperors would hire these fierce warriors as their own elite guard. The Varangians would march in the palaces they once tried to plunder. Their axes now sworn to imperial service. Even as battles raged, the Vikings turned westward into uncharted seas. In 986, Eric the Red, exiled from Norway and later from Iceland, gathered followers and sailed into the unknown. He discovered Greenland and there founded colonies amid the ice and rock, harsh and unforgiving, yet proof of the Viking drive to seek new horizons. His son Leif Erikson would carry that vision further still. Around the year 1000, he sailed beyond Greenland to a new land across the ocean. The sagas tell us he called it Vinland for its wild grapes. This was North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Though the settlements were short-lived, they revealed the extraordinary reach of the Viking world. But closer to home, power struggles continued. In the year 1000, the Baltic echoed with battle. At Svold, King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway found himself betrayed, surrounded by a coalition of enemies from Denmark and Sweden. His fleet was trapped, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Olaf fought with unmatched courage, But when defeat was certain, he leapt into the sea, choosing death over capture. With his fall, Norway slipped into the orbit of Denmark, losing independence, and reminding all that the Viking world was as divided as it was fierce. Yet the Vikings were far from finished. In 1013, Svein Forkbeard, king of Denmark, invaded England. Seizing the crown, his sudden death left power to his son Sienna, who between 1016 and 1035 ruled not only England, but also Denmark and Norway, forging what became known as the North Sea Empire. For a time, the Vikings ruled an empire that rivaled the greatest powers of Europe, stretching across 3 kingdoms bound by sea, and still Sienna as reign brought stability, prosperity, and Christianization, a striking contrast to the chaos of the earlier raids. But the old gods still lingered in Scandinavia, and in 1030 the clash between pagan and Christian came to a head at the Battle of Stiklestad. To seeking to reclaim his throne met his enemies on the field. He was struck down and killed, but in death his legacy only grew. He was declared a saint. His cult spread rapidly across Norway, and beyond his martyrdom sealed the triumph of Christianity across the north. The hammer of Thor gave way to the cross of Christ. The old ways faded, and a new order emerged. Still, the Viking fire burned one last time. In 1066, Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, one of the last great warrior kings, sought to claim the throne of England. He sailed with a mighty host, and as Stamford Bridge clashed with King Harold Godwinson, it was a battle sung of for generations. Harald Hardrada fell with an arrow to his throat, his army broken and scattered. It was the final great invasion of the Vikings. The age of their dominance was ending. Yet fate played one last trick, for only weeks later Harold Godwinson marched south to face another invader, William, Duke of Normandy, descendant of Rollo and the Vikings, who had settled in France centuries before. At the Battle of Hastings, William triumphed, Harold was slain, and England fell to the Normans. Though the Viking age was declared over, its legacy lived on, reshaping the future of England, Europe, and the world. From the burning sands of Iona to the glittering walls of Constantinople, from the icy shores of Greenland to the vineyards of Vinland, from the founding of Dublin to the crowning of Sienna and the fall at Stamford Bridge, the story of the Vikings is one of relentless energy, unyielding ambition, and constant transformation. They began as farmers constrained by harsh lands. They became sailors, raiders, traders, and kings. They changed the face of Europe and even touched the edge of North America. Though their age ended in 1066, their influence echoed through centuries in language and law and bloodlines, and in the legends that still stir our imagination today. The Vikings were more than warriors. They were dreamers of horizons. They refused to remain still, and their restless spirit ensured that their story would never be forgotten. The end and the legacy. The Viking age was not eternal. It rose with fire, steel, and sails. But like all empires, it eventually declined as centuries passed. The once unstoppable raiders who terrorized the coast of Europe began to fade into history. Their decline was not sudden, but the result of many forces pressing down upon them: political, religious, economic, and cultural forces that reshaped Scandinavia and transformed the Vikings from fearsome warriors into settled rulers, traders, and storytellers. Let us step into the twilight of the Viking Age and explore why their reign of terror ended and what treasures of legacy they left behind. First, king politics. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the kingdoms of Europe had grown wiser and stronger. The days when monasteries lay open to easy plunder were over. Fortified stone castles rose across England, France, and Germany. Their walls were too high for Viking axes, their gates too strong for sudden raids. What once had been rich and helpless towns became bastions of defense. Local rulers no longer cowered. Instead, they built armies and navies of their own for the Vikings. Each raid became more dangerous, each voyage less rewarding. The political map of Europe hardened into kingdoms that could no longer be so easily cut open by longships. Then religion played its part. Christianity spread steadily into Scandinavia, carried by monks, missionaries, and even Viking rulers themselves. What had once been a warrior culture that celebrated dying in battle and dreamed of feasting in Valhalla began to shift. New beliefs taught peace, humility, and eternal salvation in heaven, not endless glory in combat. By the year 1000, most of Scandinavia had begun to accept baptism, and churches rose Where once only rude stones and pagan shrines had stood the gods Odin, Thor, and Frey still lived in the sagas. But in everyday life, Christ became the greater power. With Christianity, the violent warrior spirit lost its central meaning if Valhalla was no longer the prize, then dying with a sword in hand was no longer the ultimate goal. Economics also reshaped the Norse world. The early Viking age thrived on plunder. Each raid brought silver slaves and goods that enriched entire communities. But as time passed, trading became far more profitable. Then raiding Scandinavian merchants traveled the markets from Byzantium to Baghdad. Silk, spices, and silver flowed into their homelands, and new wealth was no longer forged in fire and blood, but in contracts and exchanges. The Vikings became traders, settlers, and kings rather than pirates. For every longship carrying warriors across the sea, another carried goods to distant markets. Commerce replaced chaos. Integration into the European economy replaced the days of pillage inside Scandinavia itself. Power was changing. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had once been loose networks of chieftains and jarls gradually united into centralized kingdoms. These kingdoms were built not on raiding parties, but on feudal structures and stable governments. Kings demanded loyalty, taxation, and order. The wild age of sea rovers gave way to the more predictable age of states. Warriors now served lords within their homeland rather than taking to the sea to find fortune abroad. The spirit of the pirate brotherhood was replaced by the discipline of the medieval monarchy, and so the Viking Age, which began in blood, ended in transformation. But though their swords grew silent, their legacy did not vanish. The Vikings carved their mark deeply into the world. Geographically, their voyages created cities that still stand today. Dublin, once a Viking settlement, grew into the heart of Ireland. York in England became a bustling Norse capital. Normandy in France, born from a treaty with Rollo, would one day give birth to William the Conqueror, who forever changed England. The map of Europe still carries the fingerprints of Viking ambition in language they left invisible, yet powerful traces. Old Norse words slipped into English and remain to this day. Simple everyday words like sky, egg, knife, husband, and window are gifts from the Viking tongue. Every time these words are spoken, the echo of Norsemen lingers, reminding us that their culture mixed with others and endured in exploration. The Vikings achieved feats that were nothing short of astonishing. They settled Iceland and Greenland, braving the cold edges of the Atlantic. They sailed farther than any Europeans before them. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, reached Vinland, believed to be the shores of modern Canada. 500 years before Columbus, Vikings set foot on North America. Though their colonies there did not last, the fact remains that they crossed oceans thought impossible at the time, proving their seamanship was centuries ahead of others. In culture, they left behind sagas and myths that still stir the imagination. The tales of Odin the wise, father of Thor, the thunder god, and of Loki the trickster are retold in books, films, and art. Their mythology continues to inspire warriors and dreamers alike. The image of the longship with its dragon prow cutting across stormy seas remains one of the most enduring symbols of courage and adventure, and in spirit the Vikings embodied a restless hunger for the horizon. They were not content to remain in narrow fjords. They looked outward across oceans, rivers, and continents. They dared to go farther than others. They risked everything for glory, wealth, and discovery. That spirit of pushing boundaries lives on in our modern explorations, whether across ocean, space, or the digital frontier. The Viking Age officially ended in 1066 at Stamford Bridge, when Harald Hardrada of Norway fell in battle against Harold Godwinson of England. Just weeks later, Harold himself was defeated at Hastings by William of Normandy, a descendant of Viking settlers. Thus, the end of the Viking Age was also the beginning of a new era of European history. Their swords no longer struck terror into villages, but their bloodline, their language, and their legends endured. The decline of the Vikings was not a tragedy, but a transformation. They did not disappear. They evolved. From raiders, they became rulers. From destroyers, they became builders. From outcasts, they became part of the very fabric of Europe. Their age of conquest ended, but their influence never truly died. And so when we look back at the sagas, the ruins, the words, and the maps, we must remember the Vikings were not just pirates or invaders. They were farmers, traders, poets, kings, explorers, and visionaries. They shaped history with both axe and or with both fire and story. Their greatness was not measured only in what they conquered, but in what they created. And here lies the final question for us to ponder. Were the Vikings merely men of violence? Or were they builders of a new world? The answer is both, and that is why their legacy endures. They remind us that even the fiercest storm eventually becomes part of history, but the memory of its power never fades, because the Vikings once ruled the seas with unmatched courage. They once struck fear into the hearts of kings. They once set sail to the edges of the known world. And though their age ended nearly 1,000 years ago, their legend still sails with us, reminding us of the greatness they once held and the fire of discovery that still burns in us all.